when criminals out there have heavy workloads and they're stressed. And maybe we have mechanisms to help with the things that are sort of strain and
You haven't become aware of that?
no.
Oh, this is the biggest problem in external programs. This program here. I never was around to help this program. It hasn't been in the regular university someplace that there was an in-group of graduate students from the preceding group that came and told us, hey, look, this is what you got to do if you're going to survive in this program. They pulled us aside and over coffee in the cafeteria, finding out what I had to do with the graduate school. And it was altogether different than what I was told by the professors and by the dean on Institute Club and the Catholic School. And once I found out how to do it, it was possible to cope with it, to organize yourself to get through it. You're in a real problem in a situation where you're all isolated from each other, and you don't have a chance to build up that student culture surviving capability.
Well, just the one point here the next week is the delinquent subculture developing apart from structurally induced failure made more humiliated by the American belief that man can make something of himself. You know, that's the stress that we place on not only ourselves but on other people. You know, you should do better than what you're doing.
But we don't have a voluntary choice whether or not to do that, really, because for us to participate in this culture, we have to, like if we want to play ball games, we have to agree to some of the basic rules that are generally in the background of what you do if you play ball. And you have to find the rules of play and follow them. There's usually only one set of games going on.
You know, I wouldn't try to be better than the guy who's playing with us.
Yeah, but that set of rules of competition are the set that govern most of the rules operating in our society. And we have a choice as it comes out. We can either learn to cope, learn how to deal with that competition and coping, or we can learn how to, what's the other word we use for it? To say, hey, we can do things better than this. We can figure out how to teach people through a series of the symptoms and essentially look at the episodes.
One of the reasons that remember they talked about all the different things about literacy stuff and education things they've done, and yet reducing the speed limit to 55, which is an enforceable law or change, actually reduced the death rate and the fatality rate more than all these other programs for all 1 year.
Yeah, or designing a double set of brakes in cars. Probably to save a lot of lives. We don't see that advertising anymore because the automobile companies don't want to indicate they're pushing unsafe cars prior to that time. Because you have this thing. And what in fact they were. They didn't have nice brake systems until about 10 years ago. Once the brake required them, probably a lot of lives saved. That's something else. The driver having a car with double set of brakes and everything, it doesn't really have a choice whether to disconnect them. Of course he does if he's going to not to go and take care of it. In terms of things that are enforceable, you know, but that's another, that's the end of the whole life. Yeah, but it's very important to realize the government did not make a decision to reduce speed to save lives. It's terribly critical. That just happens to be a happy byproduct that helps the government cover its embarrassment with being unable to cover its balance of payments and unable to control its foreign policy and a bunch of other problems. That's all it is. I mean, that it happens to save lives is a very incidental program, which gets us into another topic. But it's a neat, natural experiment that illustrates it is possible to make structural changes that will decrease mortality. And if that's the object of medical and health care, is to decrease mortality, we should have our eyes open to this stuff. You know, this had nothing to do with doctors. It had much more to do with Arab oil sheiks and politics and Middle East and a bunch of other things. You know. Yeah, its byproduct is there's a lot fewer people paraplegics and running around in wheelchairs and a bunch of other things the rest of their lives. And a lot of fewer people who do fewer people are killed. All these things are side fall effects of some forcible structural change. Let's put some other, I don't want to cut off discussion. We have some other ideas about thought. Took the other hand up there. Joe, you have something to say? Cookie, do you want to say something? I see your hand up.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with what you're saying. I'm looking at something when you're talking about an automobile accident, you may not have any control over this type of thing, whereas if you're talking about being in a so-called dangerous type of situation from smoking cigarettes, you definitely have control or could have control over that. So I don't know.
But speed definitely is a factor in that.
Yeah, but there was just a study released where the speed hasn't decreased.
No, that study said that they
It
were
was-
the speed limit.
They exceeded the speed limit where they were slightly under 70, and so it's not a proven fact that just putting up signs saying 55 would
How
increase
fast did they go
mortality.
before we put up a big sign?
Nobody did a study. So
Well, let's go to the fact of safety belts,
A
though,
few years ago, we drove 90 miles an hour.
on the open towns,
I just
Texas
got
and
through
everything.
driving 90 from Birmingham, so
But I mean, you know, I've been and seen in plenty of morgues bodies that have come in mutilated because they've been in safety belts, because they've used safety belts, whereas if the belt wasn't on them, they would have had a chance. So, you know, you can argue on both sides of the coin, and I think he says this.
Well, I've seen some
Here.
lower class suicides too. But you just remember, we're talking not about individual cases. We're talking about probability statements. They always have to be, set aside probability. Science is not deterministic, so this individual will, this individual won't. But at least 100 cases, at least 1,000 cases, this percentage will, this percentage won't. And I don't know, no, I'm strongly suspicious that having the seatbelt on would work to my disadvantage sometimes. But I'm strongly suspicious that the propaganda that the National Safety Council and the government puts out, that wearing the seatbelt is mostly a safety device. You'll be protected more times than not. It's a good thing, and it's true. You see the point that I don't know what you're arguing about seatbelt position, but I'm willing to, when I'm out on the highway and I recognize that some fools have to come down the road, long lights on, driving the wrong lane, head on, okay, around the corner or something. And I'll have no control and not be able to stop the accident. But having a seatbelt on will enhance my chance of survival versus not having a seatbelt on.
See, I don't agree with that.
Well, I don't, all the statistics I've seen indicate that, okay, there are some people who are trapped in vacuum tunnels, or some people who fall in canals and so forth and drown because of seatbelt. But the odds are that having seatbelt on will increase your likelihood of surviving.
It prevents one
Unless you can show me something other than individual examples when it is not. You can show me statistics of a representative sample of all head-on accidents or all automobile accidents. It's a representative sample, and show me a breakdown of percentages that would indicate clearly that wearing the seatbelt is hazardous to your life. Then I'd be inclined to not accept your statement. I mean, I can understand that you could have your opinion, but you must understand the difference between each of us having opinions and trying to say, okay, this is what the data at present show. And the data at present would indicate having a seatbelt on is safer than not having a seatbelt on. Now, there may be studies that show it's the other way around. I don't know the study. I would profess my ignorance. I'd love to see some studies. I'd love if you could present some information, Cookie, that would convince me that your opinion is backed up by data. You're probably gaining confidence when I tear out the seatbelt. You see what I'm saying? I respect your right to have an opinion. I hope you respect my right to have an opinion. But I'm talking about something more than opinion. I'm talking about what are the studies that are available?
See, the things that I have seen, and I mean, that's what we all need to go by, instead of just reading statistics out of a book. When you're working in a hospital, and your lab that you're working in is right next to the morgue, and you're seeing this on a daily
Okay,
basis.
well, let's stop and think about the methodology involved. This is a good problem. And the reason I get my back up in a situation like this is because as a social scientist, I constantly have to wrestle with the idea that, well, for instance, some basic things in sociology, like Durkheim's study of suicide, which was done back in the 1870s. Those of you who think in sociology know all about Durkheim's study of suicide. It was a very kind of neat example of epidemiology of suicide, looking at the distribution of different groups to try to find the social factors involved in the cause of suicide. And by doing it, he demonstrated that suicide wasn't caused by mental illness, as mental illness was identified and conceived at the time, which is basically schizophrenia. It wasn't depressive. But basically, the insane asylums in France at the time he was doing his studies were to be in the insane asylum was pretty clear indication they were suffering from schizophrenia. Very few mental depressive, contrary to what the present thing would be. But that was kind of breakthrough because most people at the time believed that mental illness caused suicide. Okay, many people still believe that. Well, he demonstrated it wasn't mental illness. He demonstrated statistically, the same way that I'm doing statistical analysis. Now, people who understand statistics probably distrust them, don't like them, and say, "Gee, it contradicts what I was afraid." And so, when the social scientists would sit down and go over a bunch of things, saying, "Okay, suicides are less prevalent among groups that are high in solidarity." Social solidarity being social glue that holds people together, commitments and things. Thus, married people are much less likely to commit suicide than people who are single or divorced or separated. Married people with children are much less likely to commit suicide. People who have other people dependent upon them, or who in turn depend themselves upon the people, are close bond, much less likely to commit suicide than people who are, alienated or separated and broken out from the social structure, only loosely tied in. A whole bunch of things. He demonstrated that people in certain kinds of occupations, in certain religions are high, in suicide, others are low in suicide. Okay, so after we go through all of this, trying to demonstrate social causation can be traced out statistically, and I try and point out, okay, remember, this is just like a life insurance program. When you do a statistical probability thing, you're not, if I'm a life insurance agent, I'm writing policies on everybody in the room. I know with some certainty that one of you, given the age range and sex distribution, occupation, I can say that within, 5 years, 10 years, one of you are going to be dead, and I know that 2 or 3 of you are going to survive for 50 years or something like that, okay? I know that all the rest of you will die in the treatment, okay? Now, I don't care which one of you dies and does not die. As many. Because all I'm concerned with is figuring out the probability for the people's class so I can calculate my odds to collect from you more money than I pay out to you, okay? And I want to try to collect not too much money so that you go and deal with my competitor, but since you're kind of ignorant of statistics, I'll collect as much money as I can, okay? And so I'll sit down and figure out the probability. So even though I'll lose in some cases, in other words, suppose it's going to be, Bill kicks the bucket first. Okay, I'm collecting enough premiums from me. But on the other hand, Carol's going to outlive the thing, and Lynn's going to outlive, and Cookie's going to outlive the thing, and I'll collect like mad from them, and they'll never get back as much as they pay in. And so they're going to make up for Bill's case. Okay. Now, the point is, though, after I've gone through this expression about suicide, as, say, for instance, being higher among Protestants than among Catholics, being higher in urban areas than in rural areas, being higher in commercial occupations than in, say, farming occupations or trade occupations, something like that, being higher among single people than divorced people, or single people than married people. There's a whole bunch of categories that they're kind of uses, and later epidemiologists have also used in their study. And to get through with all that, finally I have somebody in class say, well, I remember Uncle Harry, who was a Catholic and was married at the time, and all these things committed suicide. And therefore, what you're saying is a bunch of hogwash, just like Cookie, I won't believe it. And so, because it goes to the whole, it threatens the whole set of understanding of social probability, and you've wrestled with your methodology, I hope, in the course before. But I still have to back up here and look at the kind of situation that might create some opportunities for statistical imbalance here. Now, let's assume that somebody is working in a morgue, okay? And the morgue sees what kind of people? Dead people. Mostly. Not dead, comes out. He makes newspaper headlines, like the poor fellow did here a month or two ago. Okay, so mostly dead people go in this search. Cookie's office is here, I don't know what she's doing. She's watching all those dead people. And she notices that of that, those that come by, say, 50% were wearing seat belts. That say of all of the people who come in here, 100% are dead. They're wearing seat belts. 50% of them were not wearing seat belts. And she says to herself, well, I don't know, is that the number? Is it higher than 50% were wearing seat belts who were dead?
A little bit higher than that.
Well, how high? You name the figure.
About 58%, really.
Okay, well, I'll say 60% just for a non-convenient figure. So she thinks to
That's right.
60% of those things are dead, and therefore it's very dangerous to come in, for that. Now, can any of you suspect that there may be some difficulty here in something we call a self-selection of the sample?
Yes.
Now, self-selection of the sample is a rather rare thing. Do you see it, Cookie, yourself? I mean, you're basing something life or death decision on. You're betting your life on your conclusion. I think you're good in statistical error and judgment. And it's a good methodology course. I welcome you to come to Baptist College undergraduate course, which I teach, by the way, Tuesday and Thursday. Methodology of social research. Okay. What do you think the error is, Mike?
I think one thing you've got to deal with here is the source of information. I mean, and the record driver sees that this person has seatbelt on. Where it gets back to the ambulance driver, to the emergency room nurse, to the hospital. So if you find a person with a seatbelt, the DOA doesn't wear one, it's no big deal.
Well, I don't understand what you're saying.
In other words, you have someone that's not wearing a seatbelt, and he's killed in a car crash. That's an everyday
Not
occurrence.
publicized.
Nobody said anything.
So you may not be aware. In other words, the 40% that are coming in you don't hear may in fact not have been wearing this. I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. That's basically what I was thinking about. Let's go over here, Bill. We'll come back to it because it's going to be dealt with. Let's one at a time. Everybody have a chance.
That 100% may represent, let's say, 10 people. Doesn't take into the fact that 90% of maybe 100 people that live could have been wearing seatbelts.
Yeah, you don't know what percentage of this is the people who walked away and didn't go to the morgue were wearing seatbelts. In other words, you don't know what percentage this 100% is of the total number of people who were involved in head-on collisions. And until you see, Cookie, what's a basic error in
Well,
your
you
life.
also don't know what percent walked away without the seatbelt on also. I mean, that goes, I almost flunked probability. We just finished statistics. So I do have problems. But you don't see two sides of it. You don't see the people walking away that have seatbelts on. You also don't see the people walking away that didn't have seatbelts on.
Well,
I mean, really, we've got to look at both sides.
The point is, you have made up your mind. You think you have enough information to make a life decision, a life and death decision. I don't think you have enough information. I don't have enough information in that information to make a life and death decision. So therefore, I'm willing to buy the published studies report rather than to not buy them. Gary?
Well, I wouldn't buy a lot of published reports, because they can be made up. The thing you need to go do is down to the police station that reports the accidents and see what they say.
You think the policeman on the scene is most likely?
I think his report will have more in it than or be more likely the truth than some of these published reports. That,
Okay.
as in the case when we talked last week about the guy with the cigarettes that said that smoking cigarettes does not lead to heart disease, when the cigarette manufacturers were the ones who sponsored his report. That could be the same people that sponsored this.
Yeah, it's very important to actually look at, see who's doing the studies and to read the study yourself. And I've read a bunch of those studies.
I think the police would be unbiased.
They sound legitimate to me, but I quite agree with you that the most sensible thing to do is probably to do your own investigation and to actually do some examination of police records. That makes sense. To set it up in such a way that you would somehow capture all the accidents that involve. How would you measure things? Injury to people? because you can't do it in terms of property. How do you separate the fender benders from really life-threatening accidents?
Well, you just have to take a representative sample and.
No. I mean, you've got to establish criteria before you do your sample.
Sure.
What criteria would you use to differentiate fender-bender accidents from life-threatening accidents?
Well, they may have.
That's what they're looking at, but you see, then you're not getting a representative sampling
bodily
of those
damage.
who would have been killed but weren't killed.
I think just bodily damage.
Okay, if there was some bodily injury, any bodily injury, even a cut or a broken finger or a stubbed toe would count. Any bodily injury on up to date. Okay? If there wasn't bodily injury, you wouldn't consider it as part of your thing. Now, that would automatically skew your sample. So if a person was wearing a seatbelt and didn't have any bodily injury in, say, a 35-mile-an-hour crash, he wouldn't be in your sample. Whereas if somebody who wasn't wearing a seatbelt did have bodily injury or scratch, he would appear in your sample, and he would be a live subject, and he would not, even though he had a minor wound, you wouldn't know whether, how serious. So that particular, I wouldn't buy that as a criteria. I think you have a better sample than that. Yeah, Roger.
Well, I think you're proving her point, though, while you're sitting there talking about it. You know, I really do, because she's saying that she took, although her logic might be shallow, you know, well, you know, I'm just saying she just took her word, but she also, I'm sure she was familiar with the reports, the statistical reports. But
I'm
she
sorry
took-
I didn't publish them.
She took her own experiences and made a decision. Where you're saying now, that's what we're going to have to do.
No. I'm simply saying that if for you to really verify the other people's studies, it probably would be necessary for you to go down and examine the criteria they use, examine the way they've been done, look for the sources of bias in their work. And if you couldn't find any source of bias, probably you could believe it. If in fact you found some sources of bias, then of course you would throw out the results and publish it. And Cookie, I'd encourage you to publish this stuff. I mean, if you've got hard data, write it up as a report and submit it. And I guarantee you something as dramatic as that would make news. Okay? And nothing else, Time Magazine or someplace like that would pick it up. Even if no reputable
National Enquirer.
stuff, because it's totally under the control of the establishment. Okay? No, I really have doubts about the all I was trying to do when I did this was put on the board was point out to you that unless you can specify what these 10 people were in relationship to all of the people who were exposed to the danger of a collision of some kind or other, of those people who were injured in the collision, of those people who were killed in the collision, what the proportions of each of these circles were that were wearing seatbelts and weren't wearing seatbelts. And so you can determine percentages along that. You can't make a statement whether the studies are good or bad, or whether your conclusion is justified or not. But to see only the people coming in the morgue, you've got to self-select, and you would expect, if what the published national studies say are true, you'd expect that most of those people coming into the morgue would, in fact,
That's a big if.
go ahead.
Very good.
Jerry?
Correlation here about the small selective sample. I think all statisticians do this. When they want to prove a point that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer or heart disease, well, of course, it's easy to make a correlation. Most of the people in the United States, a large percentage of people in the United States do smoke cigarettes. So obviously there's going to be a lot of people who die from heart disease and lung disease who do smoke cigarettes. But there are also a heck of a lot of people out there smoking who never die of lung disease or heart disease. And there are also a lot of people who die from lung disease and heart disease who never smoked in their life.
Should take my question. That's how sad that
Well-
Let's call it quits on this topic and back up a little bit.
But, you know, it's not like some people use bear.
When,
I have a lot of stat towards my town there, you know, and any industry can use stat to prove a point. They can go out and they can take their own statistical study and use it to prove their own point, just like the bear, Anderson or whatever it was. Now that's 9 out of 10 people, you know, get better relief from this product. Okay, what 10 people? You know, or the doctor can't. Anybody can take a stab.
Well, but what you're saying, this is what upsets me in the Courts and Sources Act, is you're essentially threatening the basic set of assumptions that measuring relationships between variables. In a science in which we cannot subject individual subjects to laboratory experiments, it's in a very controlled way. Our major way of determining causation, or inferring causation, is through making statistical correlations. And those statistical correlations rely upon knowledge of probability, which is science, which is stated. Now, you know that just because it is possible to lie with statistics, all that means is it's very difficult to use them to determine truth. But you have to, if you're doing it scientifically, in other words, if you're trying to extend the boundaries of knowledge, you participate in the scientific enterprise, not being a public relations thing for tobacco corporation, television industry, or safety council or something like that. Use them in ways for your own good, but you're trying to use them to further knowledge of some physical science, such as psychology, sociology, or medicine, or heaven knows what. But if you're doing them with the idea of furthering knowledge, one of the canons of science that you have to accept, just like taking the Hippocratic oath to a doctor, is that you won't deliberately select your findings. That you won't deliberately misconstrue your statistics. That you will not deliberately mislead. That you will not deliberately attempt to confuse people with what you're doing. You won't deliberately try to select subjects for your sample to come to the results you want. That you won't cook your data. In other words, there are certain ethics that a scientist, has to buy into, and he has to attempt to accept the procedure of scientific research, which are intersubjectivity, in other words, the test of reliability, reporting all of his research findings, report the procedure that he went through in designing his research, conceptualizing it, operationalizing the variables, drawing his sample, doing his measurements. In other words, to be a scientist, as a scientist, you have to buy into the norms of science, and you have to, as best you can, follow the steps of the scientific method. And that has no room in it for the type of stuff that advertising agencies do when they're trying to hype claims for one kind of aspect versus another. You know darn good well if a blind doctor is reporting, what that means is that one blind made a choice, they prefer mouth of magnesium or lactate kind of thing. Well, how many, they sent out 10,000 questionnaires, 5 came back, or maybe 100 came back. Of those, of every 9 that were making a preference, they chose Northern or something like that. We don't know who would pay it off most. The public is generally skeptical of those kind of things. You can't confuse those kind of claims and statements with the kinds of things done in the name of science that are published in scientific journals. And however, may have bias in them, and they may have faults of human beings trying to prepare them. And you should remain a cynical skeptical on that kind of stuff. And just because it's published in scientific document doesn't make it so. It simply means that publishing a scientific document, a journal, you have included enough information so somebody who is a doubting Thomas can go out and check. And recertification.
Recertification based on.
That's one of the things that's really critical about it. It sets off the family specialty from all other supplies. Like it's the only specialty that requires, it's just a type of requirement. Some of us would use it for